Think back to 2018. It was genuinely surprising, wasn't it? Seeing Eritrea and Ethiopia, after all those years of tension, suddenly making peace.
It really was. Borders opening, embassies reopening. It felt, well, significant, a real shift.
Exactly. But okay, let's get into it, because now, fast forward to May 2025, and that optimism, it's pretty much evaporated.
Yeah, completely. We're seeing these really worrying signs now, military buildups. The whole specter of war seems to be back on the table.
It's a stark reversal, and it's concerning.
It is. The articles, the research reports, all the news analysis we've looked at, they paint a pretty clear picture of things deteriorating and fast.
What's really striking is just how quickly that hope seemed to dissolve into, well, the kind of mutual suspicion and hostility we're seeing today. So the aim for this deep dive is pretty straightforward. We're going through these sources, trying to pull out the key insights, understand what's really fueling this dangerous return to tension.
Right. What are the core issues? What actions are both sides actually taking?
And what could it all mean for the Horn of Africa, which is already, let's face it, a pretty complex region.
Precisely. We need to get to the heart of it. And a really key element, something that's been there for a long, long time, is Ethiopia's ambition for direct access to the Red Sea.
That's right. Ethiopia, as the reports remind us constantly, is a huge landlocked country. And Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, he's been very explicit about this.
Yeah, calling it an existential issue.
An existential issue, even a historical right. That's strong language. And the sources suggest it resonates deeply within Ethiopia.
But if you flip that coin, you immediately see why it's such a flashpoint for Eritrea. For them, it's not just about, trade routes or economics.
No, it cuts much deeper.
It goes right to the core of their sovereignty, their territorial integrity. They fought a long, brutal war for independence, which they finally got in '93. So any move by Ethiopia towards their coastline, towards their ports, it's seen as a fundamental threat, maybe even, a prelude to annexation attempts.
And it seems Eritrea's worries aren't just about a direct land grab. The analyses we read really highlight this deep suspicion they have about Ethiopia's deals with Somaliland.
Right. They see that as Ethiopia trying to kind of sidestep Eritrean sovereignty, find another way to the Red Sea.
So this fundamental clash of national interest, Ethiopia's push for the sea versus Eritrea's absolute determination to protect its territory, that really does seem to be the primary engine driving this crisis, doesn't it?
It certainly looks that way. And then layered on top of that, you've got the whole aftermath of the Tigray War.
Yeah, that's complicated things hugely. Yeah. Initially, during that conflict, Eritrea and the Ethiopian federal government they were allies against the TPLF.
A seemingly strong alliance at the time.
It seemed quite robust, yeah. But as our sources show, that alliance fractured pretty badly after the November 2022 Pretoria agreement. The deal meant to end the Tigray conflict.
And the crucial point there, as you mentioned, is that Eritrea was left out, excluded from the negotiations.
Big time.
And that exclusion was a major turning point. It created this deep resentment, a real breakdown of trust between Addis and Asmara.
You can imagine Eritrea felt sidelined, maybe even betrayed, after playing such a key role in the war effort.
Exactly. And despite the Pretoria deal calling for foreign forces to withdraw, reports keep cropping up suggesting Eritrean troops are still present in parts of Ethiopia's Tigray region.
Which, understandably just ramps up the suspicion on the Ethiopian side. And it's not just about the governments, is it? The research points to these ongoing power struggles within Tigray itself, different factions potentially leaning towards Addis, others towards Asmara.
Yeah, it just adds another layer of complexity to an already messy situation.
So, okay, we've got the Red Sea issue, unresolved, the fallout from Tigray, the broken alliance, and then comes this next step, direct accusations of meddling in each other's internal affairs. That feels like a significant escalation.
It really does. Ethiopia is pointing the finger at Eritrea, accusing them of backing insurgent groups inside Ethiopia, particularly in the Amhara region.
Right, and undermining the federal government's allies in Tigray, too.
And then, on the flip side, Ethiopia is reportedly hosting Eritrean opposition groups, most notably that group brigade Namemadu, the Blue Revolution.
That conference they held in Addis Ababa back in January 2025. The analysis we read framed that as a particularly provocative move.
Highly provocative. Imagine how that landed in Asmara. It's basically signaling support for groups actively trying to destabilize the Eritrean government.
So these actions, supporting these proxy groups, it looks like a deliberate strategy, doesn't it? Mutual destabilization. pushing things closer to the edge.
It certainly seems that way.
Yeah.
And it leads us directly to these really worrying signs of military posturing mobilization on both sides.
Yeah, starting around February 2025, we started seeing credible reports about a nationwide military mobilization in Eritrea.
The sources detail reservists being called up, new travel restrictions being put in place, especially for people under 50.
There were even reports about former military personnel under 60 being ordered back for training. That kind of large-scale mobilization suggests, well, a pretty high state of alert.
No doubt, and those fears were probably amplified by reports of Eritrean troops moving near Ethiopia's Afar region.
Which geographically is very close to that strategic port of Assab we keep mentioning.
Exactly, and then there was that reported missile test off the coast of Assab in February. A clear signal, a demonstration of military capability.
And the Ethiopian response wasn't far behind. By early March 2025, reports started coming out about Ethiopia moving its own federal forces, even tanks, up along the northern border with Eritrea.
And mirroring the Eritrean moves, there was also a noticeable buildup of Ethiopian forces in their part of the Afar region.
All while Prime Minister Abiy kept up the rhetoric about the existential need for Red Sea access.
Right, though he did offer assurances, saying Ethiopia wasn't looking for a military solution. But Asmara, well, you can understand why they'd be deeply skeptical.
Especially with those reports, which you mentioned earlier, suggesting Ethiopia is involved in large-scale drone manufacturing. That kind of thing fuels suspicion, even with official denials.
Absolutely. So if you look at their militaries, it's an interesting contrast.
Ethiopia's got the bigger population, bigger economy, usually means more resources to the military.
True. But Eritrea, as the research really emphasizes, is a highly militarized society. It's deeply ingrained, partly because of their history with Ethiopia and that system of indefinite national service.
Formidable force in its own right.
Definitely. And strategically, that port, Assab, is key. Its location, quite isolated down on Eritrea's southern coast, could, maybe, make it seem like a tempting target for some kind of limited Ethiopian strike.
But that same isolation could also make it easier for Eritrea to defend, potentially.
Possibly. And then you've got the Tigray region sitting right between them with those armed groups we talked about. It's a dangerous potential flashpoint for proxy fighting.
So you've got the military buildup, the proxy accusations, and then the official narratives from both sides, which seem just miles apart. Abiy keeps talking about peaceful dialogue for Red Sea access.
But Eritrea's reaction consistently has been really sharp. Our sources quote them calling Ethiopia's rhetoric misguided, outdated, even warmongering.
They flatly deny they're preparing for war themselves and accuse Ethiopia of basically using the border issue as an excuse to start something.
And that back and forth blaming over who's supporting which opposition group just digs the trench of distrust even deeper.
Yeah. And it was a pretty big signal, wasn't it, when Eritrea and Egypt put out that joint statement in March 2025?
Asserting that Red Sea security is just for the coastal states.
Clearly a message aimed straight at Ethiopia.
Absolutely. And it just highlights how these tensions aren't happening in a vacuum. They're embedded in this much wider, really complex regional picture in the Horn of Africa.
It's a web of alliances and rivalries.
Exactly. The research reminds you it's not just Eritrea and Ethiopia. You've got the conflict still simmering in Sudan, where there are reports both Addis and Asmara are backing opposing sides. That's certainly not helping their own relationship.
No kidding. And then the external players, the UAE, seen as closer to Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia reportedly leaning more towards Eritrea. They add another layer. They could fuel things or maybe play a mediating role.
It's possible. And that reported security pact between Eritrea, Egypt, and Somalia that's seen widely as a countermove aimed squarely at Ethiopia's regional ambitions, especially that Red Sea goal.
So with all this escalation, these regional dynamics swirling around, the potential human cost of another war is just horrifying to think about.
It really is. We saw the absolute catastrophe of the Tigray War, the deaths, the displacement. Another war between Eritrea and Ethiopia would almost certainly mean another massive humanitarian crisis.
Huge refugee flows, terrible suffering for ordinary people caught in the middle.
The international community knows the risks, of course. You've got the UN, the AU, both calling for everyone to step back, de-escalate.
And several countries, China, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, they've been mentioned as potential go-betweens, mediators.
The EU has also said, quite clearly, they want to prevent a war. They're willing to back mediation, maybe even offer some economic incentives to sweeten a deal.
It's interesting, though, the U.S. seems perhaps a bit less visible in this crisis. compared to how involved they were in trying to resolve the Tigray War.
Yeah, that's an observation some analysts have made. And the problem is, with all these different international actors, they all have their own interests, which could help mediation if they coordinate or actually hinder it if they work at cross purposes.
Right. So it brings us back to the big question we've been circling around. Is war actually imminent?
Our sources, they give a kind of balanced view, I suppose. On one side, yes, you have all those worrying signs. The military movements, the hostile talk, Ethiopia's very clear Red Sea goal, Eritrea's absolute refusal, plus the proxy fighting. It all points to a significantly higher risk.
Definitely higher risk. But on the other side, Abiy has said publicly he doesn't want war. International mediation is still, a possibility, however tricky.
And Ethiopia does have its own internal problems, security challenges, economic strains. That might make a big external war less attractive or even feasible right now. It could strain their resources too much.
So what seems plausible, according to some of the analysis, is this idea of coercive diplomacy from Ethiopia, using the Red Sea talk, the troop movements, as leverage.
Could be, but it's a dangerous game, isn't it? Brinkmanship like that carries huge risks of miscalculation. Someone misreads a signal, things spiral.
And Eritrea, given their history and that deep mistrust of Ethiopia, they're likely viewing every single move with maximum suspicion.
No doubt. And then Ethiopia's internal situation is its own wild card. Could it act as a brake on war? Or could leadership, paradoxically, see an external conflict as a way to rally national unity? It's unpredictable.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on Eritrea and Ethiopia in May 2025, it's clear the situation is, incredibly precarious.
Deeply precarious.
A full-on war might not be absolutely guaranteed tomorrow, but the direction things are heading is deeply, deeply concerning.
There's an urgent need, really, for serious efforts from both Addis and Asmara, obviously, but also from the international community to try and pull things back from the brink.
Before it does spiral into another devastating conflict.
Absolutely. This whole situation just throws into sharp relief those massive challenges to stability in the Horn of Africa. How do you balance the national dreams and needs of one country, like Ethiopia's sea access, with the absolute necessity of regional peace and respecting the sovereignty of neighbors like Eritrea?
It's the fundamental question.
It is, and given all the history, the alliances, the competing interests, finding a way forward that actually works, that addresses Ethiopia's needs but fully respects Eritrea's sovereignty, that's the critical challenge. Preventing more conflict depends on it. So maybe something for you, the listener, to think about. In such a charged environment with these deeply embedded ambitions and historical scars, what kind of truly new diplomatic thinking might be needed to break this cycle? What could actually build a foundation for lasting peace, not just another temporary pause?